Okay, so this is the Bible study for it's an intro to Exodus and then Exodus chapter 1 verses 1 through 14. So we're just starting this book. We usually do an introduction Bible study, which gives us some really important pieces of sort of history that help us understand the book as we move forward studying it. So we do that. We used to do a whole week just doing that, and that whole week um, sort of sets the stage for the rest of the studies and sets us up ready to interpret the Bible properly and all of that. And then I started noticing that we have visitors sometimes on the week when we study that. And that week of studying the history of the Bible and kind of it doesn't bring a lot of depth of, some cool insights of what we get out of when we actually study the Bible. It sets us up for those that are going to stay and be with us, but it doesn't do a great job of giving us new revelation from scripture that particular week. So in recent years, I've combined the introduction with a little bit of text from the Bible where we actually do get into that, shortened kind of both a little bit. But we do I think the other thing is when we have new folks that haven't studied the Bible a lot, they don't know the answers to the questions. And usually when we do a study, you can, if you read the text, you can usually find the answers to the questions from within the text. But the introduction Bible studies are not that way. You have to have a commentary or a study Bible or at least Google to try to find the answers to the questions. So anyway, so we're going to actually read the first 14 verses of the book of Exodus. And by the way, if at this point in the history of our church, since about 2006 or 2007, when I started writing Bible studies for our church, which was before I became the lead pastor, I've kept track of all the books that we've studied. We've studied about 46 books of the 66 books of the Old and New Testament all the way through. During that time, we have not studied the book of Exodus. So that's been about 16 years that we haven't studied the book of Exodus. And so the book of Exodus is a good book, man, some rich history. In fact, as I was reading some background on it, it's been said that it might be the most important book of the Bible. Now, we could certainly argue that. We might suggest Acts or something like that. But even the book of Acts builds on the Old Testament, and even what's in the New Testament builds on the Old Testament. And for most of Israel's history, God was stating, I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. And guess what? Exodus is the study of their exit from Egypt, from how God brought them out of Egypt, and it sets the stage, both in the suffering, which Israel is often identified with throughout the centuries, and in God's bringing them out and His salvation in the midst of suffering. It sets the stage really for who Israel is, and Genesis is sort of an origin story of the world and then of Israel, and we meet the 12 sons of Israel, of Jacob, the tribes of Israel, in Genesis, but we leave them off at the end of Genesis, and at that moment we don't know much about the tribes of Israel, other than these men who in childhood sold their brother because he was the favorite, and he was they were jealous, and we kind of leave it off there with Joseph in Egypt. And then how did they become Israel? How did they come back together? How did the tribes form and grow? and how did they form who Israel became, and then ultimately how we understand God's interaction with his people. And that sort of sets the stage for the entire Bible. So you could say that it may be more important even than Genesis, and but good thing we don't need to rank the Bible books by how important they are, because God's given them all to us together, and we have them all, and they all make up what's necessary for salvation, and completely reveal that. So anyway, let's go back and let's read Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan and Naphtali; Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. All right, well, that took an ugly turn very quickly, didn't it? So remember that you can download a PDF copy of our Bible study at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And if you're studying it with us right now, you're going to find it right at the top. And if you're not, then you're going to find it somewhere further down. Number 1 says, what type of book is Exodus? Now, this should be an easy question for those who study the Bible quite a bit. Maybe a more difficult question for those of us that are new to studying the Bible, but that's why we put it in here. So what type of book is Exodus? A says gospel. It is not a gospel. Gospels are in the New Testament. The gospels are the story of Jesus, and they begin the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and introduce the story of Jesus as Messiah, that is followed up, as we learn in Acts, about the early church, and then in the epistles about the growth of the early church. B, the prophets. It is not one of the prophets. The prophets make up, basically starting in Isaiah all the way through Malachi, the end of the Old Testament. Those are the prophets. They're organized in major and minor prophets by the length of the book primarily. And so those are writings of men who spoke to Israel when they were off track, primarily. When they did something wrong, God sent the prophets to speak to Israel. We have their writings recorded so that we know what God was saying to Israel during that time. And that makes up a big chunk of the Old Testament too. After some of the books of poetry and history, and everything comes after C. It was part of the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch was the first 5 books of the Bible. That's what Penta means. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And sometimes those are referred to as the books of the law. So when Jesus in the New Testament, in the Gospels, tells, teaches, and talks about what was recorded in the law and the prophets, usually the law referred to the Pentateuch, and the prophets referred to the prophetic works that I already described. And that makes up most everything. The law and the prophets was basically everything except for the books of history and some poetic works. So number two, who wrote the book of Exodus? Now this might be a tricky question depending on where you read. Traditionally, the book of Exodus and the entire Pentateuch has been attributed to Moses. Now, the Pentateuch leads then into Joshua when they actually enter the promised land, which happens right at the end of, or right after Moses's life. And so Jewish tradition as well as Christian tradition has ascribed this to Moses. Now, more modern biblical criticism has begun to question that, but none of them name somebody else that they say, well, this is who it was. It wasn't Moses, it was this person. If anything, more modern biblical criticism has suggested that there may have been editors that brought together the early writings with oral tradition and put this all together in its present form as we have it. And that does not discount the idea that Moses wrote a big portion of it or parts of it, but they just suggest that sometimes it looks like stories have been merged and things like that. Now, I would say that in some cases it could have been Moses himself that edited and merged those stories. There's really nobody else that anybody has settled on to say it was this person other than Moses. And so I think we're just going to go with it was Moses. And if there was any editing done later or things put together that all of this wasn't from Moses, it doesn't really change anything about the truth of it and that it is scripture. So number three says, when did the events of this book take place? A, perhaps around 1446 BC, based on the biblical calculations from other known events. 480 years from the Exodus to the 4th year of Solomon's reign. We get that in 1 Kings 6:1. And so because they talked about the number of years from the Exodus to Solomon, Solomon was a very fruitful time in Israel, and so there's a lot of the temple was built during that time. There's a lot of archaeological evidence about when Solomon was. I think non-Jewish literature records the time of Solomon. And so that is a pretty well-established time period. So then working backwards, it looks like it would have been, 1446. Some scholars would suggest that historical data contained in the book would indicate closer to around 1260. So that would be, another 200 years later, because it's BC, 200 years later than what it would be dated from 1 Kings 6:1. That has to do with some of the cities that were mentioned. For instance, even in this first chapter, the city of Ramesses was mentioned that the Israelites were building, and that would have been probably during the reign of Ramses, and that is a recorded. So that city, the events of that pharaoh were recorded, and so we have archaeological evidence about that. So depending on what we date it from, it was either 1446 or 1260. And then C says, when we're talking about over 3,000 years ago, isn't a 186-year window close enough? I can't get within 5 years when remembering events in my own lifetime. And that's just a personal thought. We can try to nail it down specifically, but I think, you know, how good were their calendars, and how well did they keep track and remember what year it was? And did different civilizations time things and date things slightly different? And so, it's hard. And I have enough trouble remembering what year something happened in my own life. But this was 3,000 years ago, and we've got a window of less than 200 years. I think we're doing pretty good. It was somewhere around that time. Number 4, what is going on in the book of Exodus? Well, I think it's when somebody exited something, and that is true. The book is named that because of the events that happened, and the English word Exodus comes from other language, older words, and this was already called something like that in the original languages, because it was named for the main event that it describes. And that's a significant event in Israel's history that God brings up over and over. So B, this was the story of God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt into the promised land, or at least close to it. It was supposed to be into it. So that's true. So they didn't actually get into it. They were left Egypt, and then God was trying to bring them into the promised land in Exodus, and it didn't happen. And so the story of why it didn't happen is in here. And we're going to get to the place where they get close to it, and then we move on, and the book of Joshua happens. See, this is part of a five-book Pentateuch story in Israel's history leading to their entrance into the promised land. And that's true. And that says more or less the same thing we've been saying. D, this is the establishment of Israel's covenant relationship with God, and leads into the establishment of the law and their instructions for life in the promised land. So this is true. So when they leave Egypt, God makes covenant with them and gives them rules to live by, to follow him. And we lead into, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus is the book of the law, and Numbers and Deuteronomy then continue on and really refer a lot to Exodus and Leviticus, but also tell a story, some in there too. Now, so those instructions and the law were intended to give them direction for their own governance of themselves in the promised land. This is how you're to live when you go into this land that I'm going to give you. Before, you've been trying to survive and still follow me under somebody else's rule, but now you're in your own land under your own rule, and this is how you should live. And it should be different from how the Canaanites live, who are there when you get there, and different from how you lived in Egypt. You're going to live in this new way according to the will of God. Number 5, if this is the continuation of a book, what was happening in Genesis before the beginning of Exodus? A, Joseph, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, or Israel, was sold into slavery by his brothers. B, Joseph went through hardship, but eventually rose to be trusted leader in Egypt, who saved Egypt from famine by helping the Pharaoh store grain for its coming. And as a side note, also because he interpreted the Pharaoh's dream to be able to tell that this famine was coming. See, Joseph's brothers were sent to find food because of famine and found Joseph, whom they didn't recognize. Joseph saved Israel and eventually, huge summarization, brought them all to Egypt where they could survive the famine. So Joseph saved Israel, and God, through Joseph, delivered Israel. D, Jacob died, Joseph died, the end. And so sort of, yeah, that's what's happening and what happens. So we have in chapter 1, in the first few verses, sort of a summary. It says these are the people that came to Egypt with Jacob. These are the how many was here. At, the whole generation died, and these are the people that were here now. So now they had this many people, and this is what's happening. So it kind of summarizes it and introduces it all. But that's what's happening. I mean, we're not going to go back and study Genesis right now, but Genesis, that's many chapters in Genesis summarized there. And this is where we're at. This is how Genesis gets them into Egypt, but Exodus gets them out. And so we got to know how they got into Egypt and how many of them there are and that sort of thing, and what the setting is before any of Exodus makes any sense. So number 6, what happens at the beginning in the beginning verse of Exodus 1? A, we find out how many sons, and this should be in the beginning verses, not in the beginning verse. We find out how many sons of Israel came to Egypt, who and how many. That's true. This is this summary. B, we learn that this story will take place sometime later after the sons of Israel, a whole generation, had died, but their family had been fruitful and multiplied and increased in numbers. So that's true. We find out that the generation was died. Like SpongeBob SquarePants, sometime later, but at this point, that whole generation has died, and now they've multiplied. There's a ton of Jews in Egypt. See, verse 8 tells us that a new king came in power, who, and the version that I grew up reading said, knew not Joseph. A king came into power who knew not Joseph. Our new NIV version says, to whom Joseph meant nothing, which is probably more accurate. I think that's what the original was trying to say. Somebody who knew Joseph knew of his value, knew of his importance, knew of his value as a God follower who was able to interpret to the king what was going to happen, knew of his value as an administrator who saved all of Egypt. And so the previous king knew Joseph. And these king, maybe there was more than one king after that knew Joseph, respected Joseph, took care of the Israelites because of Joseph. But now somebody came to whom Joseph meant nothing. So no longer was this king going to respect the Israelites because of what Joseph had done. Rather, this king cared only for the Egyptians and what could happen if these Israelites grew too numerous. So that's what was going on here. Number 7, why does verse 8 sound so ominous to us? Because it is. It's ominous. It's scary. There was somebody before who knew what Joseph and the Israelites had done for Egypt and valued that. And now somebody came who does not know the value of Joseph and doesn't care anymore. And so they are not going to be favored because of what Joseph had done. Because Joseph had shown himself to be valuable to a previous king and had gained favor because of his foresight and ability to save the entire kingdom. If Joseph means nothing to this new king, then there may be no favor, and that may be an understatement. B, we find out in verses 9 through 10, when the king is worried about the multiplication of the Israelites and the possibility of an uprising among these foreigners living among them. This is why it's ominous, because all of a sudden he's no longer favoring the Israelites because of their past. He's worried about what they might do in the future. Because they become so numerous. Number 8, most of us have at least an idea of what happened next. How will we find encouragement in our lives when ominous circumstances arise? So what happens next is the reason for the need for the Exodus. It's that they crack down on Israel. They enslaved Israel and oppressed Israel more and more. And in the process, then Israel cried out to God, and there was a desperate need for deliverance from this circumstance. So the question is, how will we find encouragement? Do we ever have a sentence in our life or a day in our life where we realize a king comes into power who doesn't, to whom Joseph means nothing, nothing of the past? We've probably had bosses come in that no longer do we have favor because this new boss doesn't know what we meant to the 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 organization before. We have times in our life when something just changed, everything just changed, and we are no longer favored. How do we find encouragement in this? Well, we know what the rest of the story is. We know that God met them when they needed encouragement. He met them, he encountered them. And the greatest thing in the history of Israel that he had done, he did in light of this ominous statement and in light of the circumstances that came out of it. So we can find hope in our ominous situations and circumstances and statements um, because we know what God does in such a situation.